Dear viewers, welcome to the Southeast Asia News Channel. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Ukraine war enters its most intense phase, a shocking reality has shaken the West. Russia has not only endured, but has also reaped enormous benefits from this conflict. The sanctions that were supposed to strangle the Russian economy have instead become a double-edged sword, backfiring and pushing the West into turmoil. While the US and its NATO allies have poured hundreds of billions of dollars into Ukraine, like throwing money into a fire, Russia has quietly profited immensely from its valuable resources the US desperately covets. The staggering $15 trillion Russia has gained from this war is nothing short of a cold slap in the face for Washington, where the elite are gradually losing control over an increasingly uncomfortable reality. Looking at the battlefield in Ukraine, one thing has become abundantly clear. NATO's proud declarations of crushing Russia have dissipated into thin air in the face of Russia's precise missile strikes. Each elite NATO combat unit and every advanced air defense system supplied by the West now lies scattered across scorched battlefields. What the West once painted as a war to annihilate Russia has now turned Ukraine into Moscow's strategic testing ground, where Russia not only strengthens its military capabilities and sells weapons at higher prices, but also watches as NATO allies weaken both financially and militarily. So the question arises, will the US continue clinging to its dream of destroying Russia? Or will it finally have to admit a bitter defeat as the truth becomes undeniable? How enraged has Trump been as Russia gradually seizes Ukraine's precious resources? And how will Trump deal with Ukraine and NATO? Let's analyze this further in this video. On the battlefield in Ukraine, all signs point to Kyiv facing an unprecedented military catastrophe. If one word were to describe the current situation, it would be collapse. In the Kharkiv region, Ukrainian forces are not only suffering heavy losses, but are also completely on the defensive. According to the latest accusations from Russia's Ministry of Defense, reconnaissance units have detected a large concentration of Ukrainian armored vehicles and weapon stockpiles in the Sumy region, intended for an upcoming counteroffensive. However, this plan never came to fruition. As soon as the information was confirmed, signals were sent to the Russian aerospace forces. The result, a single Iskander-M missile strike wiped out all 50 Ukrainian armored vehicles in one devastating blow. Kyiv's counteroffensive was completely obliterated. To put it simply, each armored vehicle can carry between 10 to 20 soldiers, meaning at least 500 to 1,000 Ukrainian and NATO troops were eliminated from the battlefield. This is not just a simple military defeat, but a devastating loss for Kyiv. While the Ukrainian army desperately struggles to hold the line, Russian forces continue to expand their control over Kupiansk. Key high ground positions and most of the city have already fallen into Moscow's hands. Fierce battles are still raging in the western high-rise buildings, where Ukrainian troops are being forced to retreat step by step. Elsewhere, Russia faces two choices: either continue pushing to liberate Chasiv Yar, or swiftly take control of Novopokrovka to tighten the encirclement. Looking at the battlefield map, it is clear that if both areas fall, the Ukrainian troops trapped inside will have no way out. At that point, they will be left with two options: flee or be annihilated. The situation is no better in Bakhmut than in Kupiansk. In just the past 24 hours, battlefield footage has captured a series of horrifying scenes. NATO combat vehicles have been reduced to smoldering wreckage. According to Russian reports, their central forces have destroyed a large number of Western-supplied assets, including U.S. Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, French VAB armored personnel carriers, artillery transport vehicles, military trucks, as well as numerous trenches and Ukrainian UAV systems. Given the increasingly dire battlefield situation, no one understands what leverage Zelensky thinks he has to negotiate with Russia. Yet, astonishingly, he continues to make delusional statements. In an address to the international media yesterday, the Ukrainian president asserted that any diplomatic agreement to end the war would involve conditions set by Ukraine regarding the Kupiansk region. This statement is nothing short of laughable. How can Ukraine dictate negotiation terms when, in a single day, 50 of its armored vehicles were wiped out by just one Iskander missile? How can Ukraine hold its ground when its army is collapsing on nearly every front? And how can it maintain a strong stance when hundreds of its soldiers are being lost each day? War is not a chess game where the weaker side can negotiate on equal footing. It is a life or death struggle where the stronger side dictates the rules. The reality on the battlefield shows that Russia is the one in control, while Kyiv remains trapped in its own propaganda. The Ukrainian military is steadily being drained, its frontline soldiers pushed closer to death every day. Meanwhile, the Zelensky administration continues to spread false hopes. In Moscow, there is no rush. Russia is letting Ukraine keep fighting, keep exhausting its resources, and keep descending into despair. And when the right moment comes, Moscow will end the game on its own terms. NATO is left with only two choices: accept reality or continue sinking deeper into a war they can never win. Meanwhile, Zelensky grows increasingly anxious as Ukraine's financial situation becomes more precarious than ever. The shutdown of USAID by President Donald Trump is not just a severe blow to humanitarian aid, but also paints a grim picture of the financial lifeline flowing into Kyiv from the West. If the US turns its back, Europe will likely withdraw soon as well, leaving Ukraine in severe financial crisis. The issue is not just losing 30 to 35% of its budget. Ukraine could face a loss of at least 60% of its total aid as financial reserves dry up. The consequences extend beyond numbers on paper. They directly impact Ukraine's ability to sustain the war effort. Losing aid means losing more territory, and that is becoming an increasingly undeniable reality. Furthermore, the closure of USAID triggers another serious consequence. Over 90% of Ukraine's media agencies face financial collapse, forcing them to shut down. With pro-Western media losing their ability to influence public opinion, Kyiv's control over information will be severely weakened. This is nothing short of severing the lifeline of propaganda, stripping Zelensky's government of its primary tool to maintain its image both domestically and among allies. Ukraine possesses some of the richest mineral resources in Europe, with rare earth elements considered a strategic treasure capable of shaping the region's economic destiny. Ukraine's total mineral wealth is estimated at 15.5 trillion, a staggering figure that could alter not just Ukraine's future, but also the interests of global superpowers. However, Russia now controls up to 70% of these resources, including precious metal mines, oil and gas reserves, uranium, and, most crucially, rare earth elements, essential for military technology, aerospace, and electronic component manufacturing. With its expanding control over Donbass, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, Moscow is gradually transforming these mineral-rich territories into an immense economic advantage that the West will find nearly impossible to reverse. This is undoubtedly a nightmare scenario for Donald Trump, a staunch pragmatist who prioritizes economic interests above all else. If Russia fully secures these strategic resources, the US and the West will lose a crucial edge in the global technology and defense race. It is no surprise that Trump is scrambling to reclaim America's share of the spoils by pressuring Kyiv to surrender its rare earth elements in exchange for aid. However, Washington has been outmaneuvered. Russia has not only seized control of the land by force, but also holds the decisive power over its resources, rendering America's strategic calculations more vulnerable than ever. If this situation continues, the prospect of Russia becoming a global resource superpower is no longer just a theory. It will soon be a reality. When that happens, not just Trump, but the entire West will face a true nightmare. This is nothing short of a fair exchange. If Ukraine has nothing to offer, then it should not expect any further assistance from Washington. In the context of Russia having already taken control of 70% of Ukraine's mineral resources, this demand is nothing less than pushing Kyiv into despair. How will Trump handle Ukraine and Zelensky? Perhaps the answer has already been partially reflected in the actions of the Trump family. The US president's son appears to have no sympathy whatsoever for the addict in Kyiv. Recently, he posted a video mocking the Kyiv regime in the most bitter way possible. In this video, Ukraine's logo is displayed from the beginning of the war with Russia, gradually morphing into a massive pile of excrement. This image is not just ridicule, but an expression of contempt for Zelensky's government. And as if that were not enough, the clip further emphasizes that this pile keeps growing larger, a satirical jab at a country sinking into chaos and failure. When even Trump's family openly mocks Ukraine, it is clear that Washington's attitude toward Kyiv has shifted 180 degrees. If the Biden administration once praised Zelensky as a symbol of resistance against Russia, now, under Trump, Ukraine is no longer a strategic ally, but merely a pawn that has lost its value. Donald Trump's demand that Ukraine hand over rare earth minerals in exchange for aid is not a concession, but a pragmatic move. If he does not make this demand, Trump understands that Putin's Russia will swoop in and seize all of these precious resources. In reality, the areas Russia has liberated from Ukraine allow Moscow to control up to 70% of Ukraine's mineral resources, transforming Ukraine from a resource-rich nation into one that has lost control over its own wealth. These resources are mainly concentrated in Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia, with Dnipropetrovsk being the only remaining area not yet under Russian control. This is why Trump cannot afford to be complacent. If he delays further, the US will not only lose a bargaining chip in the conflict, but also allow Russia to claim full strategic advantage. This is why Trump is forcing Ukraine to surrender its rare earth minerals if it wants continued aid. Given this context, the scenario of a US-Russia backroom deal to partition Ukraine is becoming increasingly apparent. If a boundary is drawn, Dnipro could become the dividing line between two powers, where the East falls entirely under Moscow's control, while the West becomes a buffer zone for the West. When this happens, Russia will not only win militarily, but also gain the upper hand economically and geopolitically. How much has Russia spent, and what has it gained? Let's look at the numbers. Russia is believed to have lost $300 billion in frozen assets abroad. If we assume that this entire amount is permanently lost, and add the $150 billion Moscow has spent on 3 years of war, Russia's total losses amount to around $450 billion. At first glance, this may seem like an astronomical figure, but Russia's economy has not only failed to collapse, it continues to grow. Western media, which once predicted that Moscow would be crippled under sanctions, now has to admit that Russia's economy is still functioning steadily. But these financial losses are not the most crucial factor. What is even more noteworthy is what Russia has gained. The Donbas region is nothing short of a golden goose for the Russian economy. The first thing Moscow has achieved is the stability of millions of Donbas residents who had endured years of shelling under Kiev's control. As mentioned earlier, Moscow now controls 70% of Ukraine's natural resources, including precious metals, fossil fuels, and rare earth materials. Estimates suggest that the total value of these resources could reach as high as $15.5 trillion. This figure is so massive that if successfully exploited, the $450 billion Russia has spent on the war would be a mere fraction compared to the benefits it stands to gain. To put this into perspective, let's do a simple calculation. For every $1 Russia spends on the war, it could potentially reap up to $33 in returns. In fact, when compared to illicit industries, this profit margin is even higher than that of drug trafficking. Of course, this comparison is purely to highlight the financial aspect. Human lives cannot be measured in monetary terms. But from an economic and strategic standpoint, Russia has secured a decisive victory. The question now is, with its current rate of spending, could Russia face financial exhaustion? The answer is no. Estimates suggest that Russia's annual war expenditures amount to only around $50 billion. Given the vast resources it now controls, this sum is negligible. With careful management, Russia could sustain the war for another 5 years, perhaps even 10, without jeopardizing its economic stability. In other words, the so-called collapse of the Russian economy is nothing more than a Western pipe dream. Since the beginning of the war, the US and its allies have repeatedly predicted that sanctions would cripple Russia, but reality has proven otherwise. Not only has Russia's economy survived, but it has adapted and evolved in a different direction, breaking free from its dependence on the West. Given the current situation, who is truly suffering? Ukraine, a nation that has lost territory, lost resources, lost allies, and now faces the risk of partition. Or Russia, a nation that is steadily consolidating its position on the geopolitical chessboard. Russia will not collapse economically. If anyone still believes this, they are either too naive or blinded by Western propaganda. The world's natural resources are finite, and every nation needs them to develop its economy and scientific advancements. Throughout history, emperors and rulers have waged wars to seize these resources. According to Russia's ambassador in London, the US has already initiated preliminary contacts with Russia regarding Ukraine. These meetings aim to assess positions and outline the parameters of a potential agreement. Russia has consistently emphasized its willingness to negotiate, but only based on the 2022 Istanbul Agreement and the current realities on the ground. This is the only proposal Moscow considers serious, while the West has yet to make a clear decision. Russia's negotiation criteria are not based on empty promises, but on battlefield realities. At present, Russia wants the West to acknowledge the territories it controls, regions that account for 70% of Ukraine's mineral resources. Without this recognition, all negotiations would be meaningless. In this context, the US is preparing to present a peace plan with Donald Trump's involvement at the upcoming Munich Security Conference. This conference will discuss freezing the conflict and ensuring Kiev's security to prevent Moscow from expanding its military campaign. However, nothing is certain. Based on analytical data, Russia has no reason to accept a peace deal unless it provides tangible benefits. If the West truly wants to end the war, it must recognize Russia's sovereignty over the controlled regions. If not, Russia will continue fighting until it achieves its ultimate goal. Russia can sustain this war for another 10 years without economic difficulties. In reality, Moscow is not incurring losses, but instead reaping significant profits. Controlling the resource-rich regions of Ukraine gives Russia a strategic advantage that more than offsets the costs of war. The Russian economy continues to function steadily despite Western sanctions. The idea of Russia facing financial ruin is merely a Western illusion designed to reassure themselves. Ultimately, the West must understand that in war, the strong set the rules. Given the current situation, Russia holds the upper hand, while the West faces two choices: either accept reality or continue sinking into a war they cannot win. What do you think about this issue? Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe to Southeast Asia News. See you next time.